We're in a period of rapid change, and sometimes it can feel like things are spinning out of control. With political tensions, anxiety, and loneliness rising, and questions about how to live a good life on everyone's mind, finding answers can seem harder than ever. For millennia, spiritual thinkers have offered wisdom and tools to help people find their way in trying times. Advice that even a scientist like me, Dave DeSteno, is finding have a lot to offer. To join the conversation, look for How God Works wherever you listen to podcasts.
Well, good afternoon or good day, everybody here in our audience and those of you live streaming. I'm Hazel Siv, Dean of the College of Science here at Northeastern University, and it's just an enormous pleasure to welcome you all here today to this most interesting and important event. What an auspicious day to discuss science and religion when we have been treated to either the hand of God coming over the sun or something that we understand from years of science and understanding. It's a very interesting juxtaposition, perhaps chosen especially, Dave, Dr. DeSteno, I'm not sure, but certainly, no, not at all. Even more auspicious, perhaps. And here in Boston, it is a warm spring day, also a kind of, watershed moment in our very chilly and damp spring. And what an honor to welcome Dr. Francis Collins to Northeastern today. Dr. Collins is former director of the National Institutes of Health for a long time, from 2009 to 2021, serving under 3 US presidents, where it's widely held, including by me, that he did an absolutely outstanding job. Prior to becoming the NIH director, Dr. Collins was director of the National Human Genome Research Institute, where he played a crucial role in promoting the Human Genome Project. Out of the Human Genome Project came a new field, a watershed field of genomics. Genomics did not just give tools to answer existing questions, it allowed scientists to ask totally new questions that had not even been thought of before. Genomics continues to be transformative in science and medicine. It is quite extraordinary how this field has touched so much of science, so much of medicine, and will continue to do so. In addition, Dr. Collins has been an advocate for ethical and legal procedures in genetics, and he has been interested in religion. It's this juxtaposition of science and religion that brings him here today and is the topic of this important discussion. Francis Collins received the PhD from Yale University and the MD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He has many accolades, including election to the Institute of Medicine, the National Academy of Sciences. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the National Medal of Science. But I will tell you, perhaps the most impressive thing is that Dr. Collins runs a research group, and only this week published his latest paper from really groundbreaking molecular genetics and medicine work. It's quite wonderful to see the progression of a scientist, a top physician, into a top administrator, and then continuing the research that he has done. A real paradigm for junior investigators and for us all. Dr. David DeSteno is a distinguished faculty member here at Northeastern in the Department of Psychology. He directs a group called the Social Emotions Group. As the name indicates, Dr. DeSteno studies emotions and how these guide decisions and behaviors. It is a really complex field, and I'm totally in awe of the work that is done in grappling with such fundamental questions as we do: compassion, trust, cooperation, dishonesty, and prejudice. Dr. DeSteno has been deeply interested in the relationship between science and religion and the value of religious traditions. He has written multiple books, including the acclaimed How God Works, the Science Behind Spirituality. That is also an ongoing podcast. And he's a frequent contributor to top publications such as the New York Times and the Boston Globe. It is our honor to have Dr. DeSteno amongst our distinguished faculty at Northeastern University. Dr. DeSteno, I don't know if you know this, also earned his PhD from Yale University. Hey, there's a connection. Yes, it's the Bulldogs, right? Go Bulldogs. There we go. He is a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the Association for Psychological Science, and we are delighted that he has initiated and is hosting this key event today. Thank you, Dave, so much for your work. I would like to very briefly thank members of the College of Science who have helped with this event: Caroline Leary, Anna Murdoch, and Sarah Stanton. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. And with that, I will turn this over to Dr. DeSteno.
Thank you all for being with us, especially on Eclipse Day. We were just treated to, I think, one of nature's wonders. As Dean Siv said, Francis Collins is a man who needs no introduction. His work in leadership has impacted our lives in ways that are profound and will continue to unfold. From illuminating the genome that makes us who we are, to guiding much of the nation's health research when he was director of the National Institutes of Health, we'll be feeling those impacts for decades to come. But he's also known for trying to bridge an important divide in our society, what many see as a tension between science and religion. And he has a new book coming out in September titled The Road to Wisdom: Truth, Science, Faith, and Trust, that's aiming to help us all try to heal some of the divisions we're feeling and facing as a country. If you listen to How God Works, we're on a similar mission. We're looking at the science behind how spirituality works and how it can help people flourish and think about some of the deepest challenges that face us in life. And so today I am truly honored to welcome Francis to the show to share his views with us. Please welcome Francis Collins.
Well, thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here at Northeastern, and thank you, Dean Siv, for that very generous set of remarks you made. And I had a wonderful time visiting with some of your faculty and hearing about the research that's going on here, which is certainly a good example of innovation, which I guess is your hallmark, and I can see why. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So when people think of famous scientists, I think the stereotype is pretty much, for better or worse, that they're probably not people of faith. Maybe they were raised with religion but gave it up somewhere along the way. But that's not your path. You didn't grow up with religion, right?
Not at all. I grew up in a really fascinating environment with parents who were hippies before there were hippies. They'd kind of dropped out and bought a farm with no indoor plumbing and built a theater in a grove of oak trees up above our house that I'm happy to say is now in its 70th consecutive summer season. But music was what we did after dinner. It wasn't watching television. Oh my gosh, we didn't have one of those. And it was all about the arts and about literature. It was not about faith. They didn't denigrate faith. They didn't think it was something to put down. They just didn't feel that it was relevant to the way they were living their lives. So I didn't have much to go on.
Well, that's what I was going to say. When you got to college, it's usually a time where many of us are called to think about what we believe. So by the time you got there, what was your view of religion?
I didn't really think about it much. I mean, I had had a few of those moments, and I would challenge any of you to think back on those moments for you where something happens, where you just have this unmistakable longing for something outside of yourself, that you feel connected somehow to some force that's just not something you can measure. Oftentimes for me, that was a musical experience because I think music can tap into that part of who you are, and you just feel like, oh, I want more of that. And then before you know it, it sort of slipped away. And that did puzzle me, but that was about it. And so by the time I got to college, and yes, there were those discussions that happened late at night in the dorm about who believes what, and it seemed to me the atheists had the better hand of it. So I decided I must be one of those.
But then, and this astounds me, I don't think many people know this about you, you went to Yale and got a PhD in quantum science, quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
Before you went and got another degree in medicine and biology. I'm feeling inadequate as a scientist here.
It was not a linear pathway,
yeah.
Let's be clear.
But if you put those two things together, quantum mechanics and genetics, right, here you are as a young man basically peering into the instruction manuals for the universe and for human life, right? Basically seeing how from quarks to genes, all the sausage gets made. Now, I would think that might push a lot of people to feel like everything can be understood mechanistically, right? No squishy thinking, no God needed. Was that how it affected you?
As a graduate student in quantum mechanics, absolutely. If somebody tried to talk to me about anything that you couldn't measure or couldn't write an equation for that was sort of created by ingenuity, then I wasn't going to be very interested in hearing that conversation. It was like, you guys are living in some superstitious past, and I don't have any use for that.
So how did you go from that to medicine and then medicine to religion?
I had a bit of a professional crisis as a second-year graduate student. I had focused intensely on physics and chemistry and math, and biology just seemed way too messy for me to really spend any time on. By the way, it sort of is, but I didn't even realize that biology had sort of principles undergirding it, that you could make sense of it. And that's what I began to figure out as a graduate student. I had missed all of this digital aspect of life. I mean, I didn't even know that much about DNA and RNA, and all of a sudden I learned about it, and it was like, wow, this is a science that I could really get excited about. And I felt, okay, I have some sort of calling here. I was already married and a father with a small child. It was a big deal to change direction, but I felt, okay, if I'm going to change direction, let's go the whole way and just go off to medical school and really learn about life sciences that applies to the human body. Why the University of North Carolina let me in with that story is a question that I've never quite been able to answer, but they did. And it was marvelous because it was immediately this sense of, okay, this is science, but it's science about the human body, about things that are causing people suffering that maybe I could help with. This is where I should be. And when people of faith came up to me saying, you know, if you're going to be a physician, you ought to have more of a sense of why faith is important to people, I was like, yeah, but I don't think that's something I'm going to spend time on. But then I'm a third-year medical student. And then I'm sitting at the bedside of people, good North Carolina people whose lives are coming to an end. And our medical solutions are way inadequate for most of what they needed. And many of them saw that. And I couldn't help but notice that the ones who had a strong faith seemed at peace, many of them, about this, and the others who were more like where I would have been were actually tortured, tormented, angry. I thought, well, okay, this faith thing must be a pretty strong psychological crutch because it seems to provide people with this kind of ability to deal with a situation that I wouldn't want to have to think about, but now I do have to think about because here I am every day watching people approaching the end of their lives. And there was a moment, I had a patient that I was assigned to who I got attached to. She was an elderly, grandmotherly type who reminded me a lot of my grandmother. And she was a person of strong faith. And as she went through daily experiences of crushing chest pain, for which we really weren't doing a very good job of providing much relief, her Bible was in her hand and prayers were on her lips, and then she would get through it. And she would say to me, I know you doctors are doing the best you can, but I know that I have a stronger source of comfort, which is my faith in Jesus. And I thought, that's really hard to understand. And then at one point, after she told me that, she turned directly to me. Imagine this for yourselves. And she looked me straight in the eye and she said, "Doctor, I've told you about my faith, and you never say anything. What do you believe, doctor?"
What did you say?
I said, "I don't know." And I ran from the room. It was this moment of realizing she just asked me the most important question that I have ever been asked or ever will be asked. What do you believe? Do you believe in God? And I had no way of responding to that because I hadn't really spent more than a tiny amount of time even thinking about it. And here I'm supposed to be a scientist who's interested in evidence and rationality and arguments for and against, and I had fallen into atheism because it was the convenient response. It kind of seemed to fit with the community I was part of, and I had not spent any time trying to understand why that was the most appropriate answer for somebody like me. And that was a bad sense of personal failure that I had no way to shrug off.
So at that point, did you feel like it was more, I'm glad this person has this crutch to help them? Or were you actually open to thinking about maybe there's something there? And then what was your process to figure it out?
I cracked open the door a little bit, but mostly I had this sense like, okay, if you're going to be an atheist, you better be able to defend it. Not just to other people, but to yourself. And I can't right now because I haven't really studied the reasons why people have come to these conclusions. I knew there were people around me, some of my professors, who said they were believers, and they seemed otherwise like pretty reasonable people. So it must be there is a possibility here of bringing science and medicine and faith together without having your brain explode. But I didn't know what that would look like, and maybe it was time to find out. To be honest, I then started this investigation with the intention of trying to strengthen my atheism, so I wouldn't have another embarrassing moment of not being able to answer the question, what do you believe? But I was surprised when I began to do that digging, that there were actually a lot of pretty interesting arguments that tipped you more in the direction of belief.
Well, this is the point I want to ask you, because most scientists, when we're confronted with the question of should we believe in religion, the answer is, well, it's superstition, it's irrational because there's no data or strong arguments for it. Yet you make the case in your book, The Language of Faith, and in everything you say, that it actually is a rational belief system. So tell me, how do you, I'm a scientist, give me the data.
Okay, and let me be clear right up front here. I am not going to be able to prove to you, Dave, that God exists.
That's one thing we say on the show. Unless you know God's mind, maybe God likes to help people every other Tuesday. Unless you know God's mind, you can't run an experiment. So I accept that, but give me the argument.
But I can give you some rational arguments that I think make belief in God more plausible than atheism. And many of them begin with science. Why is there something instead of nothing? I don't think science is going to answer that question. Science is about the something. That seems to require some reflection on the existence of anything at all. And then there is the fact that our universe had a beginning 13.6 billion years ago in an unimaginable singularity, a flash that resulted in everything we can now measure in the universe, including today's eclipse, where all of these particles flying apart at unimaginable speeds led to the formation ultimately of gas clouds and stars and galaxies and us. What came before that? Physicists, of course, wrestle with this, and there are various theories provided, but none of them seem particularly susceptible to proof. So if you were looking for a need of some sort to postulate something that is outside of time and space, well, that would be a creator that had the opportunity to put this all in motion. You can't make that work unless the creator is outside of time and space, because otherwise you have an infinite regress and you have to decide how did the creator get created. But if you can put the creator outside, then it becomes intellectually plausible. Well, okay, that's interesting. But now look at the next step here. Look at how actually all those particles, the matter and energy, actually follow beautiful, simple mathematical laws. There's no reason that should have to be. There's no reason that gravity should be a simple inverse square law, but it is. And there's no reason that E equals mc squared, but it is. It sort of seems like somebody set this up who was like this unbelievable mathematical genius. There's a mind behind this once you start to study exactly all those laws that determine how the universe behaves. And then the next level, which really I think I was unaware of until I started to look, is even more compelling. And that is the nature of the constants in those laws that actually determine how things work. So gravity has a gravitational constant. We have measured it by various experiments. We know it to a pretty precise number, but we can't determine it from first principles. You can't sort of do the math and say, well, it has to be this number. It could have been different. But do the experiment, which we can do because we understand physics. What would happen if gravity was a little stronger or a little weaker? And this is where you sort of have your breath taken away. Because if gravity is just 1 part in about 10 to the 8th weaker than it is, then basically as all of those particles are flying apart, there is not quite enough gravity to get them to come together and to coalesce into things like stars and galaxies. It's just a really boring, sterile universe with particles infinitely separated from each other, and nothing interesting is going to happen. Certainly nothing like life. But if gravity was just a little stronger by a tiny proportion, then you've got the problem where everything came together, but the Big Bang, after a while, doesn't continue, and you have what you might call a big crunch, long before we have a chance to appear. So there's fine-tuning, and that's gravity, but the same can be applied to about half dozen other constants, that if they were off by this tiny little bit, you would get nothing interesting. You can't ignore that. And you either have to say that those were somehow set to values that would make something interesting happen, or you have to say, and this is the alternative, that there's an infinite number of alternative universes out there that have different values of those constants. And of course, we have to be in the one where we would exist, so it looks to us like it's special, but maybe all those others just aren't very interesting, but they're out there. So which of those seems to require a greater leap of faith? You know, Occam's razor seems to apply here.
So this sounds a little bit to me like there could be a creator, depending upon which religion you are. For you, it's Christianity, who set everything up, put it into motion, and let it go, kind of a deist idea.
That's Einstein's view.
But there is, in fact, and in many religions, at their heart, it's not just the cosmology we look at, but in some ways what really drives them is how we treat each other, right? At their base, when done right,
yes,
spirituality is about compassion and love and gratitude and care for people. So how about for humans? Because there are evolutionary biologists, right, who will make the argument that all of these are part of our evolutionary history.
Right. So let's go there. All the arguments up until now that I was trying to make might get you to deism, but they won't get you to theism, about a God who actually cares about you and me. And I traveled through those steps in my 2-year journey, and I might have stopped at the deist phase, except for one thing that I couldn't quite shake, and you've already alluded to it, which is this issue about the moral law, good and evil. Certainly evolutionary psychologists can argue that the fact that human beings seem to care about good and evil might just be something that was hardwired into us because it improved our chances of survival. And you can see how altruistic behavior makes sense if you're helping out your own family members because they share your DNA, and if all that evolution cares about is propagation of your DNA, that would fit. And you can even make that true about other broader groups that you're somehow related to. But it doesn't work so well with radical altruism, where people do things that are potentially dangerous for their survival to try to help people they don't even know. The Oskar Schindler sort of picture. And yet we admire that. We don't look at somebody like that and go, well, they were pretty stupid. We think, no, that's what humanity should do. That's who we are. That's the noble aspect of what we're called to do. Why do we say that? And we, of all the species, seem particularly prone to pay attention to that. Now, you might say, well, that's all cultural. Well, if it is, then it's been true of every human culture that's ever been studied carefully. Every culture has this moral law. They disagree about what goes in the good column and what goes in the bad column, but they will not disagree about the fact that you really ought to be doing things in the good column if you're going to be an honorable person. Where does that come from? I can't prove that that's a signpost to a holy God, but it sure seems like if there was going to be one, this is a pretty interesting place to find it. Right here, written in my own heart, this sense that I am called to be somebody who does the right thing, even though I routinely fail to do so. And then what do? I make an excuse, which only proves that I really do believe the moral law is there, and I had to be given a forgiveness because that person wasn't nice to me, or, I was kind of tired that day, or I didn't really want to admit to the officer that I had 2 glasses of wine. I mean, all of those things that we do to try to get ourselves out of a circumstance where it looks like we did something bad just says that we really believe we're supposed to be good people. I continue to be fascinated by that. I think the evolutionary psychology is really interesting, and if God wanted to use that approach to try to help us really understand our responsibility to others, well, that's fine, but it doesn't quite get me all the way there. And again, that's not a proof, but just think about it.
No, I think it's true. One thing we often say on the show a lot is evolution didn't design us. We didn't evolve to be saints. We evolved to be adaptive. And what is adaptive sometimes feels icky and wrong. And it's nothing that we look at with nobility. But you're right, cross-culturally, there is this imperative from Adam Smith's moral sentiments on that there is this innate desire for virtue. We all fail. Yeah. But it is there, and it cannot all be explained by probabilistic evolutionary models. It's true. When you had that moment where you accepted, I mean, it sounds like you're making the argument that you can build a rational case for why there is a God, but there is not a proof. And so the rationality can get you to the precipice, but you have to take that step over. What made you take that step over into faith, and what was that experience like?
Well, I had to figure out what kind of faith am I really called to consider. I think by the arguments we just talked about, I got to the point of saying it's plausible that God actually cares about me, that this is a theist God. But okay, how do I learn more about what that God is like? Well, we have these world religions. Let me try to understand them. And I did a reasonable job of delving into each of those and doing the comparisons. I got to say at this time, though, I was also feeling uneasy because having perceived this calling that I knew I should have to do the right thing, it was ever more apparent when I didn't. And I'm thinking, okay, if that's a signpost to God, this holiness thing, God is really holy, and boy, I am not. And I'm feeling this unease about never being able to be right with this holy God that I've just begun to realize might be out there. And here's again, as I'm studying the comparative religions, I encounter the person of Jesus Christ, who provided a possible solution to my clear falling short of what I was called to be, because Christ made it very clear, you're going to do that. That is actually very much the human condition. But guess what? I am going to be sacrificed for you to make that failure on your part no longer a barrier to your having access to God. And that was a profound, incredibly significant realization. And it was so different than all of the tropes that I'd heard about Christians say you have to be born again, or you have to be covered by the blood. And I thought, what is all that? And now, not in those terms, but in other terms it made sense to me. I finally saw what that was. And that is unique in Christianity, this individual who claimed not to know God only, but to actually be God, and to die on the cross, and who, in a sense that, if you read N.T. Wright's massive historical tome, The Resurrection of the Son of God, you can plausibly say that the resurrection actually happened. It wasn't just somebody's imagination. That's a tough one for a scientist. Okay, I grant you that. But go with me here. If you're going to believe in a God who cares about me and who actually created all the universe, it might not be that much of a stretch for God to arrange for his own son to be resurrected from the dead. That doesn't seem like an impossible leap once you get to that sense of almighty power.
So as a scientist, I think you're in a unique position to answer this. So Stephen Jay Gould is famous for saying religion and science are two separate magisteria, right? Science can explain fact, religion can explain morality. But to me, it sounds like you're saying that that's not the case. There can be a complementarity in them. So how does it affect your life as a scientist?
I was briefly enamored of the non-overlapping magisteria, and I knew Stephen Jay Gould before he died. But it doesn't work for me at all.
Why?
It basically says there is a conflict here, so you better be really careful to keep these things from touching each other, or there will be a bad outcome. And I don't see the conflict. I have not, in my 40-some years as a Christian and somebody who's practiced what I hope is pretty rigorous science, ever really seen a circumstance where what one is teaching me is in conflict with the other. You got to be careful about your ability to completely interpret either one of the truths that you're looking at, but I don't see a discordance. So then why should we be non-overlapping? Why isn't it, if I make a discovery in the laboratory, why isn't that also a moment of awe at the Creator who knew that already, and now all of a sudden we humans get to discover it too? That seems like it makes the discovery even more amazing. And especially the things we get to learn about in science, whether it's figuring out how an eclipse works or how the Golgi apparatus works, you can see this amazing beauty that science uncovers. And seeing the beauty also makes you even more wanting to worship the Creator of the beauty. I don't see why those things should be kept off in separate parts of your existence. They aren't for me.
That's fair enough, but for a lot of people, they are. So I want to talk a little bit about the polarization that's happening.
Oh, my.
Yeah. I know when President Obama appointed you as director of NIH, there was pushback from some scientists, people like Steve Pinker and Sam Harris, and the whole new atheist movement. They raised alarms because they said, Dr. Collins accepts profoundly unscientific beliefs.
They did.
So how did that affect you? I mean, I'm guessing it didn't affect you a lot because you got approved by the Senate unanimously. But how did it affect you?
Oh, it was troubling to have this turning into an accusation that therefore you can't be a good scientist because you believe in God. And my whole view of this is that if you're asking a question about nature, then you better use the tools of science, and you better not have some sort of spiritual inclination about what the answer should be. You better just do the experiment. But if you're trying to answer other questions like, why am I here, and is there a God, and what happens after you die, I think there's a place there where science falls short, and faith gives you an opportunity not to just dismiss those questions, but to wrestle with them too. And the new atheists totally were uncomfortable with that answer. And there was a time there where that was getting a lot of prominence. I think the new atheists, by the way, have kind of had their time, and you don't see as much of those arguments. What you see now more is new wave atheists who are not comfortable with the idea of God in quite the same way, but more inclined to see spirituality in other places. We are wired, I think, as humans to seek out some kind of belief. What was it G.K. Chesterton says, when people stop believing in God, they'll believe in anything. And it sort of seems like sometimes you see that around us. But I think where you're going is that in the current climate, we have also seen really troubling circumstances where the fundamental principles of faith have somehow been pushed aside in many faith communities and been replaced instead by political messages, by grievances, by anger and sense of retribution. That is the furthest thing from what the principles of faith should represent, and yet seem to have somehow stepped forward and had a terrible damaging influence, I think, on people's perspective about what faith is really all about. Remember what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. He didn't just say, love your neighbors. We're not doing that very well. He said, love your enemies. When you see the kind of things that are being said by people who claim to be Christians, it doesn't sound like you're loving your enemies. It sounds like you are declaring them as demons and wishing all kinds of ill to happen to them.
So do you think part of the problem is that for many people, faith has become more of a label than a practice? We had the theologian Miroslav Volf on recently. He makes this distinction between thin and thick practice, where thin is kind of, yes, I'm a Christian or I'm a Muslim or I'm a Jew, but there's not an engagement with the struggle of the faith. And he said that thin can be easily politically co-opted, and we've seen that time and again throughout history, versus a deeper engagement. Do you think that's part of it?
I think that's part of it. My most important spiritual mentor over the last 10 years was the Reverend Tim Keller, who was the pastor of Redeemer Church in New York and who died a year ago of pancreatic cancer. And I had a chance to spend a lot of time with him as he was facing that ultimate endpoint and trying out some interesting experimental approaches, which worked for a while to give him some extra time. And yeah, he would, as somebody observing and somewhat heartbroken by what he saw happening to the Christian church, felt that the church had somehow failed in what he would call catechesis, that we have not done a good job of spiritual education of people, that the church has turned into more entertainment than it had to sort of building a foundation of what really are the principles of faith that should not be trod upon by politics. And because of that weakness in the catechism, then a lot of people, I think, have fallen prey to all kinds of other messages without necessarily having the spiritual foundation to resist it. Yeah, some people have somewhat jokingly, but maybe it's not that different, referred to a lot of church services is first you go to a rock concert and then you go to a TED Talk and then you go home. And there's not a lot of real deep spiritual education going on there. And maybe the solution to that, part of that, needs to be a re-emphasis on the Christian Mind Project, that we need to be sure that Christianity is also attached to, as it often was in the past, with real intellectual rigor and a willingness to ask hard questions and hope to find answers.
One of the places, unfortunately, we saw this happen a lot, and I know it probably was very distressing to you, was around COVID and vaccines. And first, I'd like to just take a moment. You were involved in bringing those vaccines to us. A lot of people here, we lost people we loved. We had relatives suffer. We suffered ourselves. So I just want to say thank you for that. And we have a round of applause for that, please, for that work. But there is a deep sense of distrust in science. And it happens in lots of religions. It often is around more fundamental approaches, but I want to focus on evangelicals because I know that's where you work, and politically that's where a lot of it was. What do you think really drives the distrust in science there?
It's a complicated story. I am an evangelical, by which I'm using the traditional definition of the term as somebody who really believes they have acquired a wonderful gift in the sense of the knowledge of faith and want to share it with other people. I want the good news to be available to everybody, not in a way that's going to ram it down your throat, but at least to be willing to share. And it breaks my heart to see how so much of the evangelical Christian community has been overtaken by political messages. And it's almost easy now, I think, for skeptics or atheists just to ridicule the whole community of evangelicals because of some of the behaviors that have become so visible. The whole experience of COVID is just heartbreaking in every way. Yes, we were successful in an amazing team effort in developing highly effective, 98% effective vaccines that were remarkably safe in the space of 11 months. And yet, in the months that followed that, a large number of people, about 50 million of them, said, no thanks, not for me. What group was most likely to say no? It was white evangelical Christians, because of the suspicion that this was somehow not safe, that there was a conspiracy of some sort, that there were intentions here that were not honorable. The estimates are that 230,000 people died unnecessarily from COVID because of this broad sense on the part of those 50 million people that these were not vaccines that they could trust. So when we're talking about a crisis about truth and science and faith and trust, you could hardly imagine a more dramatic and horrendous outcome than that. 230,000 graveyards right now that didn't have to be there and now are. The history, of course, contributes here. And anybody who's sort of wondering, how did we get here? It's worth going back maybe almost 200 years to where the division began to happen between what you might call fundamentalist Christians and science. And certainly Darwin and evolution was a part of that. But you may not know, when Darwin first published The Origin of Species, leading Christians in the United States were very much in support. Like, yes, this makes sense. Now we have the answer to God's mechanism doing it. We have the how. We knew about the why. Now we got the how. That's really cool. But things happened along the way. The Scopes trial, 1925, where Scopes was a high school teacher who was brought to court for teaching evolution because that was against the law at that point in Tennessee. And the whole thing became the worst possible circus. And it just totally polarized because Southern Christians felt they had been ridiculed because of evolution. And the separation really got pretty rough. And then there was an effort on the part of Henry Morris and others around 1960 to try to make Christians who subscribed to a young earth actually scientifically credible with the Genesis flood. And that, I think, actually made things worse because it led to even further polarization between fundamentalist Christians and people who were geologists and cosmologists who just said, sorry, this isn't going to work. So all of that was the background. And I think Christians, by that experience, were feeling beaten up by science. That science was always trying to shoot down their faith and saying, you guys are just irrelevant, let's be clear, some scientists have done that and have been very destructive in that approach, and that's really unfortunate. As a result, you get to COVID, and here comes a bunch of scientists saying, we've got the answer. And on the other hand, here comes a bunch of messages on social media or cable news saying, maybe not, maybe these are dangerous. Oh, by the way, maybe there's a chip in that syringe that's going to let Bill Gates chase after you. And people are unprepared to defend against that. And these are good, honorable, wonderful people. I know so many people who got into that space of feeling unsafe about vaccines because of the information they were getting and the background that they had lived through. And they're not stupid people. They're not people who are otherwise unable to make really good decisions about everything else. But it was all snarled up in this science versus faith argument that suddenly boiled up again in a much more unfriendly way and continues now, not to get better, but probably to get worse. So trust in science amongst people of faith is in a very bad place.
Are they open to messengers from their group like you? There was a wonderful study in the Proceeding of the National Academy a while ago that showed that people are more open to these messages and these views when it comes from someone who's a member of their in-group, someone like you. But then I also saw you viciously attacked on Fox News for those views too. So in your personal experience, are people open to you being a messenger or not?
I think we're talking about trust, aren't we, Dave?
Yes, we are.
I think trust has four components. One of it, when you're trying to decide whether you're going to trust an institution or a person, first of all, do they have integrity? Is this somebody who has a track record of being honest? Second of all, do they have competence? Do they know what they're talking about? And is that based upon real knowledge as opposed to somebody who just posted something on Facebook? Third of all, this one gets overlooked a lot. Do they have humility? That is, are they able to say, I'm an expert on this, but if you're going to ask me about that, I don't really know about that. This is where celebrity advice often gets off the rails. Okay, if you're a really famous rock star, then you should be able to hold forth about something like vaccines, like Nicki Minaj did at one point. I won't go into that. That's not a good fit. But the fourth one, it took me a while to think about this, is this institution or this person somebody who has aligned values with you? If they do, you're going to be much more likely to accept what they're saying and to trust them, which may not always be the right thing. And you see where we are now, where we've all gotten so polarized and off into our separate bubbles. There may be somebody in that other bubble over there that has the information you really need, but they are not aligned with your values. And even though they have all the other things, they have the integrity, they have the competence, they have humility, you're going to disagree with that and ignore that. Whereas somebody in your bubble who may be much less actually favorable in all those other things, you may decide to believe and accept them. I didn't really think as hard about this until trying to write this book right now, but it does seem to me that's part of where we are. I thought for a while our problem was truth, that we didn't know how to find truth and we didn't know how to internalize it, and that's a problem. And then I thought, well, maybe it's about science, and we don't know how to understand science and to believe it when it comes forward with a result. Well, that's true too. And then I thought, well, it's our faith that's gotten distorted by politics, and that needs to get fixed, and that's true. But somehow, it does come down to trust. Who do you decide to trust? What are your standards? And once having done so, are you actually incorporating that information, even if it kind of conflicts with one of your previous beliefs? Because we are all people afflicted with cognitive bias in a profound way. We are not rational actors. And everything that we are trying to teach other people to do, if we think we're experts, bumps into those prior nodes in your web of belief. And if you happen to collide with something that somebody has already kind of internalized as their personal truth, you're going to have a very hard time changing their mind, even if you've got a really compelling argument.
So let me put my behavioral scientist hat on for a moment.
You're much better at that than I am.
Which is, do you think, and you can say this now because you're not the director anymore, so they can't hold you to it.
Yes, I am here as a private citizen, in case I didn't say that earlier.
That NIH missed the boat a little bit in terms of not looking at the human behavioral side of it, in terms of just funding the more basic science side of it. Not that we shouldn't.
Going through COVID, I had to conclude that's right, that we way failed to invest as much as we should have in understanding human behavior and how that intersects, particularly with health information. Because we came into this pandemic with the sense that, okay, we're in big trouble, but the enemy is the virus, and we're going to collect as much data as we can, and we're going to tell people, okay, based on what we know today, this is what we should all be doing. And they will say, okay, that makes sense. It didn't work out that way. By the way, we didn't always do it very well either. As one of those people doing the communicating, I wish that every time I had been on some media outlet saying what the recommendations were at that point, I would have said, but that's the best we can do right now, and it might be wrong, because the data is so inadequate and we're learning new things every day. And don't be surprised if 2 weeks from now, I or somebody else comes back up and says, don't do that anymore, do this instead. That doesn't mean that we're stupid or we're jerking you around. This is the nature of a scientific approach to a problem. We didn't say that often enough, and I think that caused us to lose the credibility for people who just felt like these guys don't know what they're doing.
So one last thing before we go to Q&A, and this is kind of the perfect way in. We've talked a lot about what problems religion can cause when it's used certain ways for public health. But what about the upside, in the sense that there's a lot of good religion can do? There's a lot of data out there suggesting that engagement in spiritual practices is beneficial to people's health. Some of the best of it done by Tyler Vanderweel, who's here from Harvard School of Public Health. And one thing I like about Tyler's data is it shows that, you can't do an RCT. You can't say, Francis, tomorrow, please stop being religious, or somebody else, please start going to church. But you can follow people longitudinally. And what he finds is, 33% reductions in mortality over a decade and a half, 25% lower rates of death due to cancer, cardiovascular disease, even among adolescents, where we are seeing an increase in depression and anxiety. Engagement in spiritual practices actually reduces that. Now, of course, the government can't tell people that you should be religious. One of the wonderful things about the United States is we can all choose what we want. But do you think there should be more study of this, and we should make that information available to people, because there is a wisdom there? And how do we do that in a responsible yet non-religiously aligned way?
Yeah, I think I'm glad we're going there, because I just got through saying fairly critical things about what's happened to religious communities, and I don't mean to be that way, because the people who are involved in those communities are wonderfully honorable, dedicated people who are trying to find their way, support their families, serve their God, and have just gotten, in many instances, pulled aside by other forces that are bad for them. And we should all try to do everything we can to help make this a better thing and not just criticize. And if I did a little bit of that, I'm sorry. But you're right. The evidence is overwhelming that people of faith have throughout their lives a better shot at maintaining their health, at having a more positive experience of life, of being more altruistic and more generous, which is often what we find makes us happy, by the way, is not focusing on ourselves, but focusing on others. Having more stable relationships, whether marital or otherwise. Not perfect, of course, but the shift is certainly in the right direction if you're a person of faith. So I do agree it'd be good if more people knew about that. I don't know if that will be enough to compel people to make a decision on that basis. Maybe this is me here again. I could not have become a person of faith if I didn't think it was true. It would not have been enough to say, okay, you're going to probably have a healthier life if you decide to believe in God. I would have to decide, do I actually think it's likely at least to be true? Not just culturally acceptable, not just, okay, I guess I'll show up at church once in a while because it's a nice place to be. It has to have truth attached to it. And that's obviously a hard place to get to because proof is not going to be provided. But I think you could get really close. And
sometimes you start the journey before you make the decision. There are two ways in for people. But I think, to me, what started me doing this podcast is to look at the data over and over again, and I make no claims about knowing anything about God. We never debate the fact of whether God exists or which religion is better or not. But when I look at the data, the wisdom of these practices over time help people meet the challenges life throws at them. And as we said, religion can be used for good or for bad. It depends upon the motives of the people wielding the power, just like science. But I think if we have more respectful, open discussions, we can learn a lot from each other. So that's why I'm glad you're doing what you're doing.
So I hear what you're sort of a variation of Pascal's wager here, right? That Pascal's wager, which is this argument that, okay, you could decide to believe or not believe. And then ultimately, when you die, if you actually believed in God, that's probably a good thing because it's going to go a little better for you than if you said, no, none of this. So therefore, if you're just making a bet, even if you aren't really sure, it's probably better to believe because then you might have a reward later on. Whereas if you don't believe, you could lose that reward. And there's no harm if you believed and it wasn't true. Oh, well. So that was Pascal's wager. But you're going one step further and saying, oh, it's not about what comes afterward. It's now. Let's actually say I'm going to believe because it's going to have better outcomes for my health and for my success in relationships. And I think the evidence is sort of there. So it's taking Pascal one step further. I kind of like that.
It is. And I'm not saying you ultimately have to believe. There are, if you look at cross traditions, there are things within the traditions, how we deal with mourning, how we deal with finding meaning, that some of that can be taken out. Now, we don't know how well it works removed from faith, but there is a wisdom there. Mm-hmm. And I think if we don't, as scientists, begin to ask those questions and see how it affects people, we are shortchanging the study of human flourishing.
That's right. We are impoverishing our approach to life if we don't incorporate those kinds of considerations.
With that, thank you very much. We ran a little late, but we do have time for a few questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. One of the runners will bring a mic over to you. And we have two runners, so keep your hands up, and one of the other people will bring a mic to you so that you can ask your question without waiting in between.
Hello, thanks for the talk, very interesting. So I have one short question. What do you think, maybe for both, what do you guys think is the role of scientism in this artificial divide that people have about, or the conception that people have about God? What do you think is the role of scientism? Thanks.
That's a great question. I was guilty of scientism when I was an atheist graduate student studying quantum mechanics. Again, I think I verbalized it, but I didn't name it, and I'm glad you have named it. Scientism is basically the prior assumption before you even get into the conversation that there is nothing that's worth talking about unless it can be measured in science. So you a priori reject any possibility of anything outside of nature. And there's a lot of that goes on, and many of it propagated sometimes by scientists, and that is I think, really insulting to people of faith, and it is narrow-minded, and we ought to be careful not to let that go by without naming it. No, there's a question over here. Oh. I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you so much for your talk. Your approach really resonates with me. I wanted to know, what did you learn the most from Tim Keller?
Oh, where do I begin? As much as I saw Tim buffeted by criticism, he got plenty of that, and then faced with a fatal disease, pancreatic cancer. I never saw him feel the need to grow angry or to blame somebody. It was this sense that God is in charge, this absolute tranquil equanimity about what was happening, and also not to get distracted by it. When he was dying of cancer and I would go and visit him in his hospital room, he didn't want to talk about cancer. He wanted to talk about faith. He wanted to talk about some of the things that were happening in the faith communities that he thought could stand some kind of input. He wrote in his last few months an 85-page sort of, I think it was called The Decline and Renewal of the American Church, of what the prescription really would need to be to pull out of what he saw as a very troubling circumstance. Just this incredibly intense intellect mixed together with this absolute trust and love for God.
Thank you. I was just wondering, what was the reaction like from your friends, colleagues, family members when you became more publicly religious? Was it mostly positive, negative, a mix of both?
Some of my scientific friends were pretty appalled and predicted this would be very short-lived. Okay, he's going through a phase. And I think we're increasingly surprised when that did not happen. I think my family was also kind of puzzled. Ultimately, much later in their lives, both of my parents became much more interested in this, although I wouldn't say they were fully accepting. I was fortunate that I had some other friends who also felt very much drawn the way I was to this perspective. And my very first church that I went to was not scientists. It was just a bunch of really wonderful, honorable, hardworking, God-loving people. And I learned a lot from those people.
So we have time for one more question.
Thank you for sharing everything that you have. I thought you gave a very reasonable account of some of the unfortunate dynamics within religious communities that has led to distrust in science and what perhaps needs to be corrected. Turning things around, though, and looking at the scientific community and their potential role in your analysis of trust, to what extent do you think some of the declining trust has been a conflation of science and values within the scientific community, a sense that once we know the science, then the decision-making must be clear. We don't have to weigh different aspects of well-being. We know that we must shut down versus how does this relate to relationships or education and so on and so forth? Have we, in the scientific community, conflated too much the science and values?
It's a great question. I think for the most part, the people that I had the chance to work with in the public health community, whether it was the director of the CDC or Tony Fauci serving the White House or Debbie Birx before that, all of these folks really, I think, were trying to apply all of the science that they had access to in terms of making recommendations and feeling this sense of urgency. We have to say something. People are dying all around us. We've kind of forgotten what that was like. I mean, turn the clock back in your own mind to March or April of 2020, 4,000 people dying every day, and morgues filling up to the point where you have to have cooling trucks outside the hospital to handle all the dead bodies, and you're supposed to be trying to figure out how to stop this. And so even with things you don't know that you're absolutely sure about, well, social distancing, let's try that. Was there any real reason to say 6 feet apart was the right answer? No, but it was something to maybe reduce the risk without doing too much emotional harm to people, although it did some. And it kind of spun that way for a while. And I do think there were some instances maybe where we got to the point where that humility factor that I talked about in terms of trust got lost a little bit in terms of scientists recognizing that maybe they weren't experts in everything. I'm talking about myself here as well. Did I pay much attention to the economic costs of things that we were suggesting, or to what was happening in terms of mental health issues, particularly for kids held out of school? I assumed somebody was worrying about that, but I was not really as focused as I might have been. I was just trying to figure out, how do we keep people from dying? Because I'm a doc, and that's what I'm supposed to do. So there were plenty of instances, I think, where some of that happened, and it was certainly picked up on. And then there were forces that wanted to magnify that and say, these scientists, they're all probably atheists anyway, they're all probably making money on this, which none of us were, believe me. And they don't really have your best interest at heart. They're kind of overwhelmed with their own special smarts, and it's probably better if we ignore what they're saying. And that became, in many communities, kind of the main response. Again, with horrendous consequences in terms of lives lost.
Thank you all for joining us. We're going to have a reception outside. Francis will be here, so please feel free to come and talk. But I want to give a round of applause for Francis. Thank you for coming. I also want to acknowledge the people who helped make this possible. Dean Hazel Siv co-sponsored this event and helped us get this wonderful room and put everything together, along with her team of Caroline and Anna. And my producer, Josie Holtzman, came down from Portland, Maine, to keep me in line and make sure everything sounds good. And if you listen to the podcast, she's one of the folks who does the magic and makes it sound good, because if I did it, it'd sound like a guy blabbering on in his basement. So thank you, Josie. And thanks to our other producers, Sophie Eisenberg and Genevieve Sponsler, who aren't here today but do an amazing job with us. And thank you all for coming.